Stanford University.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're officially 1 week from the election, 7 days away, which means that though our class normally meets on Tuesday evenings, next week is the single exception. We'll meet on Thursday evening next week, Thursday, November 8th, to perform a review of, an autopsy of what happens in 7 days from now. And tonight, we have a really interesting panel and a really interesting set of topics. Topic tonight is the view from California and Silicon Valley. And the idea is not to talk about California politics specifically, not to talk about ballot propositions or the particularities of the state's financial woes. Those topics might come up, but we're interested in the policy proposals of Governor Romney and President Obama and of federal policy generally for California, for Silicon Valley, for higher education, for Stanford, for technology and innovation, things that are deeply important to this university and to Silicon Valley and to California. So that'll be the topic, the main topic of our conversation this evening. And we will have the California political conversation in our final class on November 13th. So with no further ado, let me turn the floor over to Jim for some introductions.
Okay, so great. So we have, I agree with Rob, we have a great panel tonight. We're going to talk about exactly what Rob just described, and then we're going to, I'm sure, have a very free-flowing discussion. So let me introduce the first two panelists, and then let David introduce our third. So on my left, your right, is Teresa Gao, who's actually an extraordinarily interesting venture capitalist here in the Bay Area, who's at Excel Partners, grew up outside of Buffalo, New York, Lockport, New York, went to Brown undergrad, Stanford Business School, is now on the board of Brown. She's one of the great venture capitalists here in Silicon Valley. She is the mom of 2 kids, and her experience will span both sort of the technology world, the consumer world, and I think she will give us a very good perspective, both as a mom and a venture capitalist, on what this could all mean for, this election will mean for her as a mom, but also for Silicon Valley. The guy over here, I've never met him before, but I will say this, they brought out nicer chairs tonight because he was here. So he needs no introduction. He is John Hennessy. We are very glad to have John Hennessy here, and I'll just say this. He has been a fabulous president of Stanford University for 12 years.
Thank you, Jim.
And that's all he needs.
Thank you.
And he is a great educator.
Well, and our third guest tonight is to my immediate right, Anna Eshoo. Anna is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. She's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. She's also on the Subcommittee on Intelligence Community Management. And she's very proud to be the first Assyrian member of the United States Congress. Right? So we're going to pose the same question to each of our 3 guests tonight, and we'll go at it serially. Anna is going to begin. And the question is quite simply, from each of the domains in which you live and work, the Congress, higher education, high-tech, venture capital, respectively, in each of those, from the perspectives of each of those domains, what do you think is principally at stake in this election? Anna, you want to start?
Well, I would start out with the word everything. Everything. Obviously, I'm a woman, so there are so many issues that are at stake for women in this election. But what I want to do is just broaden the lens for a moment and have everyone think about the following as we consider the policy impacts of our national election on Silicon Valley. One, will the outcome be an entire new team? A Republican, Governor Romney being president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House. Now, I'm not going to comment on this. I just want to throw these things out and have you be thinking of them. I think that the American people care a great deal about a divided Congress. So which one of these men is going to be able to manage that, if that is the outcome? neither one is a Lyndon Johnson. So we know that in their personalities, unless there's something hidden with each one of them that would come out, none of them will, I don't think, hit anyone upside the face and be able to convince the way Lyndon Johnson did. Will there be will it be a status quo? Will there be a re-elected president, a Republican House, and a Democratic Senate? And if that's the case, what will happen to the far right team, the Cantor-Ryan wing of the Republican Party? Will there be the losses in the House? Will they be in that column? And what effect would that have on Speaker Boehner? Would he then become a deal maker? So I think that we need to consider that. And I think we should also consider who else goes into the White House with whomever the president is. Thanks to the Supreme Court and what I think is one of the most disastrous decisions that any Supreme Court in our history has come out with, Citizens United, there are hundreds and hundreds, probably up to $1 billion of anonymous donors and unaccounted amounts that they have donated. They want a return on that investment. So who goes into the White House and with either a re-elected president or a President Romney? And I think that these are, it's a political overlay, but we're not just voting and making a decision between two presidential candidates. I think all of what I just described is going to have an impact on the kinds of issues that we're going to speak to tonight. And I just want to say how wonderful it is to be here. It's an honor to be on the podium with all of these stars, and I'm exceedingly proud to represent Stanford University. Thank you, David.
So before we got started, we were joking with the other panelists, and I said, you know, I'm the only person here who thankfully represents no one in no larger platform, just myself. So I guess that either will make for interesting or very uninteresting commentary. I will say that I was pleasantly surprised when I was asked to join this very august panel. I guess the topic, though, being around Silicon Valley, what I can say is I think that as we look forward to this election, I just want to comment on some recent legislation that passed this year. So thank you, Anna. Thank you, the existing Congress and President Obama. The Jobs Act is something that I'm not sure how much any of you know about, but I can speak personally, if you want later, having seen a couple of my companies personally go through the IPO process post-Jobs Act as opposed to pre-Jobs Act. And what I can tell you is that I'm cautiously optimistic that we will open up the floodgates again for tech-backed IPOs. The numbers are staggering in terms of what the drop-off that has happened. And I don't just mean since 2000, which I sadly remember quite well, but really post-Sarbanes-Oxley, which had a lot of positive effects. But really, you know, just to give you some numbers, the average startup that now wants to go public after Sarbanes-Oxley, it costs them $2 to $3 million in cold hard cash to be compliant during the IPO process. That these are costs that didn't exist before, and post the IPO process, an average of $1.5 million per year just to be compliant. So those are really meaningful dollars for any of you who are entrepreneurs or no entrepreneurs, and I'm hopeful that with the new Jobs Act relief, we are starting to see the pipeline for tech IPOs increase. This is good news because it relates to not only for those companies, but in terms of jobs in the American economy. Venture-backed companies represent about 11% of all private employment in the United States. And more importantly, venture-backed job growth over these last 4 years, have actually increased 4 to 5%. In the face of employment declines in other parts of the private sector. So looking forward, what do I think the most important things are? Sort of support of the tech economy and jobs. I think it goes back, though, further, and President Hennessy will have a lot more erudite comments on this than I, but just through my work at Brown, I see the importance of government funding for basic research. And I'm sure, I hope here at Stanford, knowing that Google and Genentech and many other great companies have sprung from Stanford, that is a model that works throughout the country in government-funded research, because venture capital really doesn't fund fundamental scientific research. We fund development, we fund the D. So we really do rely on the United States government and increasingly the government, because private sector funding for core research has dropped. So I think that is the fundamental issue if I think about what's going to impact my children 20, 30, 40 years from now. And I think that has a lot to do with Congress just as much as it has to do with who wins the White House. So those, I think, are the issues thinking going forward. And the other issue, which I think several of you have highlighted, I do think immigration, particularly as it relates to legal immigration for high-demand tech jobs. We have done a great job in producing wonderful master's and PhD students here in the United States. Our universities, like Stanford and others, are still the crown jewel around the world that everyone tries to emulate. But unfortunately, we have not done a very good job with the immigration policy of being able to retain a lot of the wonderful technical talent that we graduate from these universities. And that is something that will continue to be, I think, an unfortunate challenge for job growth and for startups if we don't address that.
John.
Whoever comes into the White House will have a very difficult hand to play. They'll face probably what is one of the most difficult budget crises outside of a situation when the country's been in war ever. And it is only going to get worse as we delay dealing with the issue. We've got unsustainable growth in entitlement spending. If you plot the number out over 30 years, all the tax revenue, every dollar, will end up going to entitlement programs if you assume reasonable rates about the percentage of the gross national product that goes into taxes. So we've got to figure out how to deal with that issue. At the same time, we face an immediate crisis around the discretionary piece of the budget, that piece of the budget that doesn't go to entitlement. It roughly is divided. Half of the discretionary spending goes to defense. The other half is everything we think about, all the research investments in the country, running the National Institutes of Health, running the CDC, building roads, everything. Student loans comes out of that sliver. I think the biggest danger for the sliver that includes higher education, includes the investment in the innovation economy, things like research and incentives for doing research. The danger is that that piece gets squeezed because nobody decides they're going to champion it. We have lots of champions for various parts of the entitlement part. We have lots of champions, at least on one side of the aisle, for preserving the defense portion of spending. And the other piece is the piece that's in danger. And that could happen through sequestration, or the real nightmare would be that a deal is struck that makes the sequestration come totally out of the non-defense portion of the discretionary budget, which would mean we would see 15% cuts across the board in everything from student loans to research investment by the government. That is, I think, the big issue that whoever comes into the presidency is going to have to tackle, and it's a joint job. It's going to have to be tackled with Congress, as Congresswoman Eshoo said so clearly. I think the other issue around immigration, and for us in the university, it's a two-pronged issue. It's H-1B, but it's also the DREAM Act and the importance of the DREAM Act for us and for our graduating students in the future.
How much of the, is this one working, or do I need? How much of the essential purpose of the DREAM Act was accomplished by President Obama's executive action a few weeks back?
Well, certainly as a holding action, I think it took us a long way there. We need to figure out a way to get the rest of the way there. And this should be a nonpartisan issue. And in fact, H-1B has often been, at least it starts out as a nonpartisan issue, and an inability to come to a set of compromises that are in the best interests of the country. We should be able to get there. This is not a very difficult situation, and I think people who propose that we're going to find everybody, including people who came here as children, and send them back to their own country, it's just not a realistic solution. Let's start with realistic solutions around immigration reform and work from that to something that we can implement.
And I think it's important to note that the DREAM Act was implemented by executive order,
Right.
Which means that if Governor Romney keeps his word, but there have been lots of words, but I mean, he has not, I have to try not to, but you know, you just keep running into.
It's certainly less clear what will happen.
This is true. But he has stated that that executive order would go. And we see just in our own casework out of our district office the reluctance of so many being willing to take advantage of what the executive order allows because they're fearful that if the elections turn the other way, that a federal agency would have their names and that it would all go downhill from there. So this is very much at stake. And I think that it's always important for us to remind ourselves that we are the only nation on the face of this earth that has continued this marvelous experiment where people come from all over the world and become Americans. You can't go to another country and become Japanese. You can't go to wherever. It's only in America. And so this is, I think there will be a manifestation of this around the immigration issue in the elections. You certainly are hearing about it. But I don't have too much doubt that as important as the executive order is, that it could go. And the House did pass the full DREAM Act.
Yes.
It was the Senate that fell, I think, 2 votes short.
Can I ask Teresa a question about that? So Teresa, you were born in Indonesia, you're of Chinese heritage, right?
Right.
And now you're like a Silicon Valley mogul. So.
An American.
I don't know about
Teresa.
Mogul, okay, I care for the
American
mogul.
mogul.
Okay.
Hoping to be a mogul.
No, but truth, John is a mogul, by the way.
No.
Oh, yeah. But here's the question.
I know some, though.
That's true, that's true. Think about, this is a huge deal for Silicon Valley, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, immigration, so look, as you said, I'm a naturalized citizen. I'm a first-generation immigrant to the United States. I absolutely believe that I've been so lucky in so many ways. There really is no other place like the United States. I know I sort of feel like one of those apple pie commercials. But, you know, I mean, I grew up in a town that was so small, we didn't have any stoplights. Less than 40% of my high school went on to any type of higher education at all, and that includes community college and trade school. Some of you are going to be too young to even know what this cultural reference means, but to give you a sense, yes, it was in Western New York outside of Buffalo, but the next neighboring high school, Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, went to high school in that next high school. We graduated and ran track against one another. We worked in the same Burger King. That was my summer job. Okay, how does a kid like that get to be on this stage here with the president of Stanford University and one of the quintessential representatives who has done so much for tech to build the Valley? I mean, it's just like, you know, only in America. So I think that immigration is important not only for the H-1B visa issue or for what they're calling sort of the Startup Act issue, where if you can start a company and employ a certain number of people, you should get a visa. I think those are near-term things that are easy for me to justify as a venture capitalist because they can talk about jobs and innovation. But as a human being, as a daughter of immigrants, as an immigrant myself, things like the DREAM Act really speak to me because I think that education, and in particular, an American public education at the high school and elementary school level, and then if you're lucky enough to get into a great university and partake of student financial aid and loans, I mean, truly, you can be anything. And if you don't create those doors for people, then we're not really fulfilling the promise of what we have been for so many generations and what we should be going forward.
A quick follow-up. John, a quick follow-up on the very invocation about financial aid. This is a very tiny question, but it was of concern to a number of students on the online forum. So either in the wake of the executive order or in a circumstance where the DREAM Act passes, will those students be eligible for financial aid on the same footing as citizens are currently? In a
Well,
way
if the
that
DREAM
foreigners
Act
are not?
passed,
Right.
then yes.
But
Then they
currently,
would.
currently they're not.
Currently, the difficulties surround, there are various issues that are extremely difficult about students saying where they're from.
Yeah.
Because a student who was brought here at age 2 and is not a legal resident has to basically say they're from Mexico. So then they look like, for example, if that's where they came from or their parents came from, then they look like an international student to us, right? So there are these difficulties around this. That's why we really need the full DREAM Act. I think a Congresswoman is exactly right that the executive order did get us a long ways, and it's a holding action. But we need a full. And these people graduate. Then they need a job. And they have all these incredible skills. But they can't legally work in the country under the current
The only thing they don't have is a paper that says,
yeah.
you are an American. Otherwise, they come with everything else.
Listen, far be it from me to pour any rain on the Only in America parade. But,
Okay.
but I have to say, my mother was a Canadian. And the fact is that both Canada and Australia have a higher percentage of immigrants in their population, and that's been true for a couple of generations than the United States. So we're not the only place in the world that people come and seek up to.
The northern
we're the
provinces.
biggest and most powerful place to be sure. But listen, just to play devil's advocate for a minute about the H-1B visa issue. There was a letter to the editor in the Wall Street Journal this week, which I don't endorse, but I just want to put the question on the table. The writer claimed that expanding the H-1B visa program, that is visa for skilled workers and so high-wage skilled workers, would have the effect of depressing wage levels for native-born skilled workers, thereby discouraging native-born workers from entering high-tech occupations. Therefore, we shouldn't do it. Now, I think it's a pretty silly position, but I wonder, is there some political reality to that? Is there a constituency out there that really believes that?
There is. I'll bring it right home. That my opponent might as well have written that letter to, did you say the Wall Street Journal? Yes. So there is a view, and it's fairly widely held, that H-1B visas do exactly what you said, displacing American workers and depressing wages that are paid. Now, for those of you that may not know this, the Congress approved at one point a higher level of H-1B visas, and then we went back to the regular level. I think it's something like 65,000. It takes something like 28 days in the beginning of the calendar of the year for those to all be used up. So there is a huge demand. In examining in depth what the whole H-1B visa issue represented, both Congresswoman Lofgren and myself found that there were some abuses. I mean, we're not, wherever there is something, human beings will find a way to get around something and not be totally above board. So we introduced legislation to correct those abuses. And so there may be some that were caught in some of the abuses. But I think it's very important to keep the various categories of visas. There's a reason for them. And I think at the time that they were established, whether there were EB-5s or, I mean, my staff is really immersed in this. I don't know every last visa class, but there's a good reason for them. But there is controversy around it, David. There's no question about it.
David, I think it's safe to say, is there some effect of alleviating the shortage of engineers and scientists that exists in the country by allowing more immigrants with H-1B visas to stay? Surely there's some effect. But I think that right now is smaller than the other effect, which is companies setting up divisions outside the U.S. in order to get access to workers. That's the worst possible situation. Then we've actually created a situation where the companies have an incentive to put jobs outside the U.S. And these are high-skilled, high-paying jobs, the kind of jobs we want and need in this country. So that, I think, is the driving force we should be focused on.
I also think when unemployment is as high as it's been, that there's a resentment on the part of some of others coming into the country and being able to have, exactly, yeah.
The only last thing I would add is that I think that if you look at the H-1B visas, that's oftentimes sort of the first visa that a foreign-born person with high skills in STEM fields, particularly in computer science or engineering, might have. That's not necessarily the last visa class that they will have. And many of them go on to start their own companies. So again, in a couple of other factoids. So roughly half of the venture-backed companies, now remember those venture-backed companies represent 11% of private employment, so speaking of jobs, 50% of them have a foreign-born founder or co-founder in the company. So again, you need to think about these things just like you think about a student who gets, DREAM Act or a student visa. This is sort of where they are for the next, say, 4 to 5 years. If you follow them longitudinally, many of these people go on to other things which end up being huge net positive job creators and huge net economic pluses for America and for Silicon Valley or wherever their local communities may be. So I know it's hard because we have these election cycles that are so short, just like in the stock market we have these quarterly reports. But I think that if you really want to look at these data on human beings, you need to look at them on a longer time frame.
Longer term.
Yeah.
Extending just a bit from this discussion about the deeply held, the deep connection between various federal policies and the interests both of technology and innovation in Silicon Valley and in higher education, and Stanford in particular. One common story that's been told over the past year is the political awakening of Silicon Valley in the SOPA-PIPA fight, and the strong voice that was mobilized in something like a grassroots way. Lots of people really engaged. And I'm wondering if either of you see that as the beginning of what will be a much more prominent advocacy at the federal policy level role of technologists and innovators and folks connected here at the university, or is this a one-off thing? And I mean, from your perspective in DC, do we need that voice? And Teresa, I'm equally curious about how you see it from inside the VC world.
Do you want to rehearse the case?
Anna?
The SOPA-PIPA case?
Yeah.
The short version of the details, I might be able to...
Old media versus new media.
I don't know if that explains
It's more complicated.
the entire
Thanks,
thing.
Jim.
That's a good elevator pitch.
Well, so it has something to do with the rules concerning net neutrality and how it is that corporate ownership of various things that flow over the internet would or would not be permitted.
And change the obligations of ISPs, which is a big issue. So right now, internet service providers are not responsible for ensuring that somebody who transmits a potentially copyrighted issue actually owns the copyright, right? It's just like saying to the telephone companies, you're responsible for if somebody slanders somebody on a telephone call because the transmission is across your telephone, right? It's really no different. But that was a major shift, and I think there was an attempt to go way over that boundary, and I think that generated a strong grassroots pushback. But I think what you're seeing here is, look, for many years, Silicon Valley was blessed by being far away from Washington and not having to worry about it a lot. Those were great years. I loved it. Now, the technology and the companies within 50 or 100 miles of this spot influence so much of America. What people do every single day of their lives. And now, how they get information, how they get news, how they read, how they communicate with people. So I think we can't afford to not be engaged in Washington in this new era, because other people will be engaged and won't necessarily have the same interests that the tech community will have, or that the users of technology will have, for that matter.
On the SOPA-PIPA battle, first of all, the bill was very, very poorly drawn. very poorly drawn. And it was drawn, most frankly, by a chairman and his staff that don't understand technology at all. So it didn't deserve to have the support that it had, and as it came out, how much damage it would inflict, and what it would do to the internet, which would affect all of us. This wasn't just some sidebar, you know, just a few interesting characters on the side of the stage. It was all of us. Now, that having gone down in flames, advocacy is very important. Advocacy is always important. I thought, when I was on my way to Congress originally, that, I mean, I had such an idealistic view of how we would come up with legislation and that great minds would come together. I'd have people to my home, and we'd have the author of the book, and then we would debate it, and then out of that we would come together and draw up the most magnificent legislation. I mean, I don't know what got into me, but it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. Now, skilled legislators know how to navigate inside the institution, but Congress really does not move on larger things unless there's a real push from the outside, a real push from the outside. And you see this across the chapters of American history. Some things have taken, healthcare has taken almost 100 years to come up with a national plan, whether you like it or not, I mean, agree with it or not. But going back to this legislation and advocacy in that, it's been characterized as a North-South issue, that it's Silicon Valley versus Hollywood. And when reporters have asked me about it, I've said, there cannot be one winner in this. There cannot be one winner in this. We can't let the creativity and all of that really exports our values and our views and all of that out of Hollywood, nor can we X out Silicon Valley. So that still has to be decided. And I think the way to think of it is that, you know, the hijacking of American genius is the hijacking of American genius. So we have to come up with a framework that's going to address that. Now, I think you mentioned net neutrality as being part of this, and that is something else that is on the block, depending on who's elected. I know, because if I roll up my sleeves, I'll show you my scars from the battles at my committee on net neutrality. Yeah. My Republican friends simply abhor the notion of net neutrality. And it's mirrored with the very large telecommunications companies and all of that. But maybe someone wants to ask about that later. But there is a very different view held between the two presidential candidates on net neutrality.
So one more question to put in the mix, as it's still connected here, and it's about the role of undergraduates or graduate students at a place like Stanford or at Brown, or the Silicon Valley tech innovation community more generally, and the widely shared view, certainly amongst the previous panelists in our earlier weeks, that there's deep political dysfunction, the federal level, the state level here in California as well, and the question about how it is that students at Stanford who are interested in technology and innovation, or the companies that are being started up, can contribute to innovation in the public sector in order to diminish or perhaps even eliminate some of the dysfunction. So what's the role in general of technology, Silicon Valley, in innovating within the public sector?
So the one place where I've seen tremendous impact in the last 5-10 years on this, and happen to be involved with one of these companies, is particularly where students or recent students who live in the technology world take technology and business models that they see working in the private sector and apply it to a public sector area, but they do it on their own as a separate sort of .org, as opposed to creating a software company and trying to sell directly into the teeth of what I would call, you know, the federal, state, or local government. So 2 examples in the education space would be things like Khan Academy or Donors Choose. So these are both companies that took sort of known technologies that work for other things in the wider world, video instruction and marketplace models to crowdsource funding small projects and applied them to K-12 education. And I think those are models for how students at places like Stanford or other universities can make a difference and make impact sooner rather than later.
I would use an example right here in our congressional district of a company by the name of Palantir. And they have the ability to go into, say, Health and Human Services, which is a huge department in the executive branch, and actually target where the fraud and abuse is in Medicare. Now, if you can target that, that's approximately $60 billion a year that could be saved just in that program. So the government is, I find, very slow at reinventing itself. But there is a push, again, that I mentioned before, from the outside to help make it more efficient, to help make it more effective, and to come up with models that, that agencies, regardless of who's heading up the executive branch, be able to save tax dollars, have people learn better, faster, all kinds of models. But I mean, I welcome it every day of the week.
And from your perspective, what's the difference, if any, between the benign outside pressure that you're talking about that would reduce medical costs and so on the one hand, and the much maligned lobbyists on the other? What's the difference?
Well, they're entrenched. That's why in my opening comments, I said we have to think about who's going to go into the White House depending on who's elected and then what the composition of the Congress is. But we have very large, well-funded, entrenched interests in the country. And I saw it especially when I was on the House Intelligence Committee. Who gets the contracts? Well, in so many cases, the contracts would go to the people that always get the contracts. I'm not going to mention the names, but you can imagine who they are. And now here's an example. They would win the contract, but they hadn't even developed the technology that they were getting the contract for, versus what I just used as an example, Palantir. So it takes a lot to turn that around. And the Pentagon is a huge, huge place, and they move from the Pentagon to the defense contractors. So they have a real inside track. Those are all very, very well funded. I'm not just picking on them, but it's a glaring example. So yeah, these interests are, and now with all of this money, with what the Supreme Court did, I mean, it's we could end up being a plutocracy instead of a democracy, where you get a handful of wealthy people in the room and say, well, it's going to be you. We choose you. Is it government by the people, for the people, or is it by a handful because they have so much money? So we have a real issue on our hands, and I think that there's a better chance that President Obama will address this, and I've been after him on it with my own plan, but I'd take any plan that will go after this. I don't think Governor Romney is interested in it at all.
So let me take another issue that a bunch of the questions from the audience hit, which is something that you guys all in different ways have a perspective on, and which the two presidential candidates will too, which is privacy. Okay, so privacy, where you have 80 to 90% public support for stronger privacy laws, but we haven't had a privacy law since 1998 when Mark Zuckerberg was in diapers, or grade school at least. So, no, but let me walk down this. So, John, you're on the board of Google, which has been sanctioned broadly in Europe for privacy violations, but that has not been an issue that the US administration or Congress taken up. Teresa, Silicon Valley has completely opposed any kind of privacy legislation. And Anna, as you know, I love you very much, but I've seen you in Washington. And the Democrats and Republicans in Congress have both not moved forward at all on privacy legislation that people, both in the audience from their questions, but that kids, consumers in general, on 80 to 90% margins, want some kind of real major government action. Question is, one, where is Silicon Valley on the privacy issue? Why is it so silent on that issue when it's such a big issue for so many people in the room? And second, will Romney or Obama make a difference on privacy, or will they both succumb to the persuasions of Silicon Valley that we don't need any privacy? And as Eric Schmidt, our executive chairman of Google, said, if you don't like the fact you've revealed something, just change your identity. How about a nice softball question like that for the panel?
So I think it's an interesting question. Well, first of all, how many people in the audience use credit cards? You realize every single purchase you make is tracked. Everything you bought is tracked online, used, and resold as part of the business of running those credit cards, right? So first of all, I think it is true that we probably have a lot less privacy than we think, and we have to think about what kind of privacy we want. I think if you crafted an opt-in privacy dictate, I think you could craft something that would have the support of the Silicon Valley companies. You could do it, right? People will have to understand that they lose certain services when they opt in, but I think you can craft a bill that works. And I think we should move towards there with something that really makes sense, that works well. Part of what you're seeing, unfortunately, is some internecine warfare among the tech companies, each of them jockeying for, okay, what would hurt company X but help us? This happens, and we've seen it happen before in the tech sector. And the result will be a less satisfactory answer. There's no doubt about it. So now somebody has to come in and bash heads and really try to.
Can I ask you a follow-up? Because this is a big deal. I mean, a lot of people ask questions about it in the.
Well, security is an even bigger deal because if you think, we've got a much bigger set of holes around security than we do around privacy. So,
but here's my question, honestly, because I agree that there's a lot of internecine warfare, and Anna knows this. I know this issue fairly well in my day job. Here's the question: will the Silicon Valley guys come together on that? Because you opt in. I mean, do you really believe that we could get a form of opt-in? That is, by the way, what the Europeans are insisting
the European
upon.
system.
Right. And so, and the U.S. is, do you think
opt-in, opt-out? I think we'll get something between some opt-in, opt-out with some. I mean, the problem becomes putting in front of consumers a very long, complicated menu about what they want and what they don't want becomes very difficult very quickly. So we've got to figure out some kind of balance between an opt-out or an opt-in system that has appropriate tuning on it. I think you can make this work, and I think if there were clear dictates about trying to construct something, you could force the industry.
And Anna, could you get, I mean, look, we've had this conversation before. Come on, Congress has sat there, taken money from both sides of the aisle and done nothing. That would be a simplistic but fairly fair perspective.
I mean, you ask why is it the way it is with companies in the Valley. A, it's disruptive to many business models. All right. I think that, and I've thought this for some time because the issue is within the jurisdiction of my committee. So I see where some of the most conservative Republicans are willing to work with the most liberal Democrats on this issue. And the reason that there are strange bedfellows in this is because their privacy was punctured. And they just couldn't get over what happened to them. I think one of the unifying areas is children. Starting with children. Starting with children, because you know what? I mean, if someone stands up and says, nah, I don't think the children should be protected, I haven't met that person yet. So, I mean, why not start there? And I think in a new Congress, when the private sector sees that there's movement in the Congress, they're going to take it more seriously, and they may come up with something and then be partners on it. I think I'm encouraged by what John Hennessy just said, that we should go with opt-in. I mean, it seems to be harder to do in the Congress, but
it is hard to do.
It's harder
It is hard
to
do, and I think what you're going to have to do is present people with a more nuanced set of trade-offs, and that's going to be hard to do. But I think, look, we're going to get some. I think we'll get some agreement about do not track and what the definition of it is.
You do think so.
Right now, the problem is it's not very clear what the definition of it is.
Yeah.
And until we get a clear definition,
do you think? Let me ask a question. Do you think Romney versus Obama matters on this? Because I mean, I actually think Anna. You do.
I do.
I don't think either one of them knows what the issues are.
Oh, no.
No, that's a fair. No,
These
that's
are technically complicated issues. In that sense, they're very deep, complex issues. At the surface level, Congresswoman may be right that one of them is a bigger technology user, so probably has more exposure to it than the other.
There are important things that the president did do relative to technology for the nation. And one of his first acts was to put a chief technology officer in the administration. So he may not be able to get into the weeds as to exactly how Facebook or someone else operates in a certain area, but he certainly understands privacy. And but the flip side of it is that I know from my Republican colleagues that they're you know that in terms of a private sector coming up with what they wish to be the solution would be embraced. Let's put it
Teresa,
that way.
did you want to add something on this?
Well, I was just going to say what both panelists just said, which is I think that the challenge, with all due respect to our government, is that it is a very complicated set of technical issues, like many other things have been before, where I think, so another area, which isn't what you brought up, right, but so there's a big movement now. There have been a lot of different back and forth around patent law and whether it's been adapting in the right pace given the pace of technological change. And I think those types of issues, I think privacy is at least as complicated, if not more so, than patent law, because the rate of change of technical innovation and our ability to track different things is moving so quickly. It's very hard for someone who's not a lifer technologists to really weigh in and create. I feel almost like the moment that they create some policy, it's going to be obsolete by the time it makes its way through, which is unfortunate. So I think that the quality of people that are brought in, either at the CTO level or I will say our current FCC chairman is a startup guy, at least kind of understands that, as opposed to historically, and not necessarily saying political parties, it's been both political parties, as opposed to bringing someone in from, as you were saying, new media, old telecom, new telecom, at least it's sort of, an ISP, new startup guy. So I think there's a chance for it. But I think that President Hennessy is right. I think the best chance is to co-opt the key constituents, i.e. the tech companies. They're never going to agree fully, but get them to agree to some framework and then use that as the basis.
The only response I'd have is say on the kids issue, which I know Anna threw, the tech companies have blocked kids' privacy legislation. You know that, Anna. They've not agreed because they're afraid it's going to go up above the kids' level.
Right.
And the question to me that's what I said is ironic, and I agree with you, Anna, that Joe Barton on the right-wing Republican side is Mr. Kids' Privacy now. But the question is, I think that John's point is really, will Silicon Valley come together, no matter who's the president, and say, at least for the kids' side of this,
I don't
you can
think
move
they're
this
going
baby
to do
forward.
that on their own, though.
No, I don't think they'll do it on their own, Anna.
legislation.
I think they'll do it with an appropriate forcing function.
Right.
Okay,
But I
fair
think
enough.
they will respond.
Yep.
They'll
Okay.
help craft a bill
I
that
do
makes
too.
sense.
Yeah.
I do
Right?
too.
That I think they'll do.
Okay.
Right. Now, the
Agreement.
Patent Office.
I didn't mean to digress.
Who wants
but
to fix the Patent Office? Talk about.
We have a few in the audience here who
Well, at least we got a patent
agree.
office to Silicon Valley, John.
Yeah, we did. We
So,
did.
I
But
mean, like,
it's.
bravo for
I don't
that.
think we
Yes.
have any
Yeah.
real difference between the two candidates with respect to Patent Office.
Patents.
It just needs to be blown up and rebuilt and restarted. I mean, it's
and the
as
short
simple as
answer to-
that. And wipe out half the patents that have been given out in the last 2 decades, and that would be a good start. So.
And did I hear it correctly that you think the short answer to Jim's question is not much difference between the two candidates when it comes to privacy matters either? Did I hear that right?
Well, I think a Romney administration would prefer to have the private sector come up with voluntary
probably right.
standards.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that to be partisan. I really
No,
do
you're
think
probably
that's what
right.
the view
You're
is.
probably right.
But I still think that that children are the best starting point because there's agreement there, and I think that if the right coalition is built and that there's presidential leadership on it, there has to be presidential leadership on it, then the companies will know that there's movement, and then they'll come and work with us and help shape what I think will be good for the American people. But I don't think it'll all be done at once. I think you have to start with children. That's my view on it. So.
Let's move to a somewhat different topic, one that concerns universities especially.
Yes.
The Fisher versus University of Texas Austin case was argued just a few weeks ago in the Supreme Court concerning the use of affirmative action or an all things considered assessment which takes race into account in university admissions. Stanford and other universities, Teresa, I don't know actually if Brown was part of this. Stanford filed an amicus brief on behalf of the university which wants to continue the permission to use race. John, I wonder if you can say a little bit about why Stanford chose to weigh in on this issue and what you think the effects would be, well, perhaps not at Stanford, but more generally if the court rules against affirmative action.
Well, we did file an amicus brief. Our amicus brief, I think, should be seen as one that supports the rights of universities to make their own admissions policies and consider what's appropriate. It's not something that tries to support exactly what Texas is doing. That's not the purpose of the amicus brief. And I think that still holds. The universities are in the best position to try to consider the balance of issues as they craft a class of students. And I think quite simply, I think as our students realize, and most people who've been to education, the learning that goes on between groups of students is as vitally important as the learning that goes on between instructor and student. Right. So that, I think, is something we really firmly believe. I think we were supporters of Justice O'Connor's view on this and the need to do it. I think figuring out how that will go forward, and this is people should understand this is a difficult thing. I mean, I've talked to Justice Breyer and Justice O'Connor about it. Even the Democratic-leaning justices do not find this an easy decision because they put up individual merit and issues about individual merit and non-discrimination against an argument that the university makes that this is in the best interest of the institution and the education of all its students. But they do not find it an easy argument, which is why I think Justice O'Connor said, 25 years, we'd like to see this go away. Ideally, if we as a country could move to socioeconomic affirmative action, that would be the best way to go. And notice that one of the things in the Texas program is that they are distinctly not doing that. They are distinctly saying we need students of color from something other than the lower socioeconomic demographic. So in some sense, they're fighting against this. We will not be prepared to move to socioeconomic and replace race-based diversity programs for a while. Eventually, I think as a country, that's where we'd all like to get to. So that's, I think, why we submitted to the amicus brief. We still believe in the goal we have and in the goal of our admissions program. So.
Teresa, do you want to speak to that either in your capacity as a trustee of Brown and whether the view is similar or different to what John just explained, or from your perspective as a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley and whether or not affirmative action serves any purpose for folks after they graduate and enter into the private sector, particularly in Silicon Valley?
Right. So officially as Brown, so I don't really know. I can't speak for the administration on what they've decided to do on this particular case or our admissions policies other than what's stated on there. I will say that I think a lot of the general points that President Hennessy makes about a university and their admissions office and policy taking into account the totality of the class. I know that is very much the way all of the discussion goes, and I think anybody who believes, which I think most of the people in this room believe, is that they do learn so much from the environment and the other students that they're in that, merit is clearly a key part of it, but then if you ever have the good fortune to see some of the statistics, I mean, we are talking about people who, by any standard, there are probably 80% of the people who don't get in, are incredibly qualified. There's just not enough spots for all the qualified people. So you start with the qualification, and then you have to look at things in a totality around having enough interesting interconnections and differences amongst the class in order to have a richer educational experience. So I think that the idea that the government should be telling universities, private or public, how to do that by just looking at a bunch of numbers or a bunch of statistics that can be boxes that are filled, because I know that these admissions directors who spend so much time on each application, it is far more than that. It's incredibly nuanced. So I just feel that it's hard to think about how that can be. And if you took it from that perspective, it's interesting, right? Because now I almost sort of sound like a conservative Republican who's saying like, the government shouldn't be telling me how to make decisions about my business. It just happens to be that my business is university admissions director. So then I think as a venture capitalist, I think, the idea of valuing diversity, there have been a bunch of studies, in fact, some that just came out fairly recently, done by, of all things, the Wall Street Journal, that in looking at venture-backed companies that had some diversity in either their boards or their senior management, they found a statistical correlation, of plus 20% above the confidence level, that these companies that had some diversity versus companies that had no diversity at all performed better as measured by higher percentage of IPOs, higher percentage of acquisitions for greater than the capital that the companies raised, or getting to cash flow positive. And this was a study on several thousand venture-backed companies, because the Wall Street Journal Dow Jones actually has the definitive data set on venture-backed companies. So I think that the data is pretty clear. And as a capitalist, that's what we look at, which is, what's in the best interest of increasing the likelihood of us making a return. So as a person, I have personal values that say that's great. I can't make that case to my investors, like Stanford University or others. I have to make the case that, no, this is statistically going to make you more money.
Right. I think it's important to understand that the 10% solution that's the core of what Texas does is not a solution that will work for the elite private institutions which pull their students from all over the country. We cannot say we're going to take the top 1% of all high schools in the country, because that's far too many students, right? So we have to figure out a solution that works for the institutions that are choosing their students nationwide, and it's going to have to be something that's a holistic review method.
What happens if the case goes the other way here at Stanford?
So that's a very good question.
I'm not supposed to ask the questions, but I can't help but, I'm listening and I can't help but wonder.
I think the view that is widely held is that if they throw out the bathwater, they'll keep the baby, so to speak. So the Texas plan may be declared unconstitutional because of the second layer that they've added to this, that is. But probably they will not undo the original settlement from that Justice O'Connor originally authored. The Michigan case, which, remember, the Michigan case split too. There was a law school case and an undergraduate case. They lost one and they won the other. And I think something that's based on holistic review, and that, and I think the court has said quite clearly, you first have to use whatever race-neutral methods are available to try to get diversity, and only then can you resort to race-specific mechanisms. For us, there are no race-neutral.
Can I ask one follow-up? This is what you said, Teresa, but to you, John. So Teresa said, but if Stanford looks at Excel as an investment, they're only going to look at our returns. So I want to ask you a question. John, if Excel or Kleiner or Farallon, or you name the investment institution, said to you, we're going to give you a good return, but we're going to have a social quotient with that, would you consider that investment? Because you just said Stanford would never look at that because it's all shareholder value. It's all how much money we can make. John, would you look at an investment where they had a social quotient attached to that investment?
You know, that's a good question. It's a good question. We've only looked at it in the inverse. Namely, is there a negative social impact associated with a particular investment? Right. That we've done. We've never done it in the positive direction. I think believing that it's our primary job is to try to do social good with the income we get from the endowment. Right. And rather than sacrifice the endowment returns, we would probably opt for higher endowment returns and then deploy that money, as we do now, for financial aid and other important goals.
Okay.
Again, if I could change the subject just a little, I want to direct the question to you, Congresswoman. And looking at the arc of your career in Congress, you've been in the minority, you've been in the majority. When you first arrived in Congress, I think you were in the majority.
One term.
And then quickly went into the minority, and then came back to the majority in 2006. Yes. And then the minority again since 2010.
Which does she like better?
Well, I think I know the answer to that question. But I think just for the benefit of everybody here, could you just describe the culture of the Congress, what it means to be in the majority or the minority? How does it feel in terms of your efficacy and your political leverage, your importance, or what have you?
It's a wonderful question, and it's an important question. The rules of the Senate and the rules of the House are very, very different. They're like night and day. If you're going to be in the minority, be in the Senate, because they have a lot of power. Each senator has a great deal of power. They can still go to the floor and amend a bill. I mean, I could go on, but I don't want to spend time on the Senate because I'm a House member and I love the House. I love the House. The House obviously is... That's right. And a very interesting, this is one of the things that I just love about it. And that is that when the framers were making their decisions, it only applies to the United States House of Representatives that say, if God calls me tonight when I leave Stanford, there has to be a direct election to replace me. There are no appointments to the House of Representatives. And it is the House of the People, short-term accountability, 2 years. The entire House of Representatives is up, all 435 members every 2 years. So what is it like? I have obviously served in the minority for most of my service in the Congress. I have never adopted the mindset that my voice is less than anyone else's. So I start out with that premise. I really do. I mean, that is ingrained in me. And I respect other members and the people that sent them there. And I think that's something that's been lost because there are a lot of ad hominem attacks. And there's always been great debates in the Congress. That's part of democracy. Now, for the short time that I was in the majority, when I first got there, I don't think being in the majority meant all that much to me. All I knew is that this is the way it was. And at that time, you really had some really crusty old men that were the chairman. Now I've learned that, you know what, don't cross me because I have a vote too. So, but you know, in my first term, I got a lot done in my first term, but the rules of the House, and everyone should know this, the rules of the House are such that the majority party is in charge of everything, of everything. Of the Rules Committee, they decide what legislation comes out of committee, whether it dies in committee. They decide whether a bill comes to the floor. They decide how long the debate will be for each side. They decide what amendments will be made in order. So they control everything. I'm just going to throw something out. You know what I'm really proud of, despite all of this being in the minority? That under 3 presidents, they've signed my bills. So you can get things done in Congress. You can. But I think that you have to be persistent. You have to be tenacious. You have to have highly meritorious ideas. You have a great, great idea, I'll tell you, you'll get people to work with you. One of the, I shouldn't say dirty little secrets is, I mean, it doesn't sound so nice, so pretty, but you have to have not only tenacity, but patience. Most legislation does not mature in a 2-year period. I mean, I've had legislation that I've, on a continuing basis, since the mid-90s, I had a bill on the lifetime insurance caps that are in all of our healthcare policies. It was the disabled community here at home that said, this is in the fine print. I didn't know that, but they told me. I introduced legislation, and I'll tell you, it was just slow walk, but I stayed with it, and it became part of the Affordable Health Care Act, and today that language is gone. That language is gone from our health insurance policies. No one will hit a ceiling because there isn't one. So, you know, I mean, it can be done. It's frustrating. I think it's more frustrating. It can be far more frustrating being in the minority, but you have to look for opportunities and optimize them.
But you see, you have to be a tenacious and patient optimist, like our Congresswoman is. You must be.
I want to push you just a little further on this,
Sure.
maybe into territory you don't want to go, but I'm going to push you anyway.
That's all right.
So of the 2 minority phases of your service, 94 to 2006, that's phase 1. Phase 2 is the post-2010 period. So it's the Newt Gingrich period and the John Boehner period. Is there any qualitative difference between minority status in those 2 stages?
Well, there's a difference in terms of who the leaders were and what happened in Congress. People don't talk too much about Newt Gingrich anymore because he's gone. But make no mistake, he left a mark on the House of Representatives, in my view. And the 2 most preeminent congressional scholars, Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein, have written, I think it's a must-read if you want to understand what's happened and why, and all the frustrations that you have, that I have, why it happened. He really injected toxicity in the United States House of Representatives. And it has not, he's gone, but it is still there. Enter Tea Party. This is a whole nother world. This is not mainstream conservative Republicans. I'm not talking about moderate Republicans, and I'm not talking about moderate to right. I'm talking, well, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say the word.
Far right.
Because it is, it's very serious in terms of what they brought into the Congress. A war on science, a war on science, a war on science, rejecting evidence, rejecting facts, dispelling or not embracing our history and what the history means to us as far as history can be instructive. So again, going back to my opening comments, if there are losses on the Republican side in these elections, will it be the Tea Party wing? And if so, how many? And even if the Republicans retain control of the House, that changes it. It changes a lot of dynamics. So that's the way I would describe it. But let me leave it on a little higher note after talking about toxicity and some forms of insanity. And that is that, yeah, I did say it. I did say it. I did say it.
That's what I thought you were thinking of.
Yeah, that's, you know me well, John. That every time I go out onto the floor of the House, which is many times a day, every week, I am struck with the sanctity of that place. That President Roosevelt spoke there. How many presidents have come to the House of Representatives? They come to the House. The Senate come as guests of the House. The diplomatic corps comes, and the Supreme Court is there, as well as the leaders in the executive branch. So, you know, for all that is and has been said about the House and the Congress, it's a very, very important place. And I think that we all collectively hope that whatever the composition is, that it will be there for the country first. But it's a very important place. It's a high privilege. Very few Americans have ever served in the Congress. So I pinch myself when I go out on the floor and think, isn't this something that I'm one of them, and that you know, my parents are watching from heaven, so I've got one on each shoulder saying, do the right thing. Yeah. That's the way I would describe it, David.
Here's one question that comes back to California and doesn't touch on any particular political issue here, but is one that's in stark contrast to the federal system. And I'm thinking of the ballot proposition and initiative process here in California. Leaving aside any conversation about particular initiatives coming up in a week, lots has been written and opined about the value of the ballot initiative process in general, and in particular the role that money that backs particular initiatives play. So I wonder if you have an all things considered view about whether California is wise to have such an initiative process, especially as it stands in contrast to what goes on at the federal level.
Can I interject a historical note on that?
Yeah, that's
Because as it happens, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the initiative process in California. It was Governor Hiram Johnson, introduced the initiative in 1910, and it was thought to be, in the way we all understand the term, a progressive matter that would put legislative power and political power more directly in the hands of the people and get around what was then thought to be a very corrupt legislature. So that's 100 years ago. Now, Ron George, the recently retired Chief Justice of the California State Supreme Court, has gone around the state talking about, among other things, the initiative process in the last year or two. And here's a story that he tells. When he clerked for whatever U.S. Supreme Court justice it was, I can't remember, that justice, like a lot of justices and other people for that matter, carried a copy of the U.S. Constitution in his jacket pocket and would take it out and refer to it if conversation or argument got to that point. And Justice George said, and I'd like to do the same thing as the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. I'd like to carry around a copy of the California Constitution. But he said it's the size of a small city telephone book. Because, get this, if you regard the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, as an organic part of the Constitution itself, the original Constitution, which I think is a proper thing to do, then the U.S. federal Constitution has been amended 17 times since the 1790s, okay? The California Constitution was written in 1879. So it's about 100 years younger than the federal Constitution. It's been amended over 500 times. It's now, we're told, the longest Constitution in the world. Its only rival for length in terms of sheer verbiage is the Constitution of India, which is a country of 1 billion people with 200 and some official languages.
And a model of good governance.
Yes. So thanks to the initiative process, I mean, this is a classic case of be careful what you wish for, the law of unintended consequences. We have a patchwork constitutional and statutory regime in this case, in this state, as a direct result of the overuse of the initiative process. So there's this little historical background, and I'd be delighted to hear your views on it.
Well, I can just say, looking back over decades and working in the political vineyard, that the process at that time was something that really came up from the grassroots, but it's been hijacked. Now individuals are paid $5, $8, maybe even more dollars per signature. They are huge interests. It's a lot of money in it, you know, so it's been permeated by that. And I also think that legislating, because that's what so many Californians think, that they're expressing their opinion about the issue. They actually are legislating. You're lawmaking. And so there are so many unintended consequences in this, and but what were genuine reforms, it was born out of that great intention, and it functioned that way for some time, but it has morphed into something that is, I don't think is really working well for us at all, because this is not about some populist expression of the people of California anymore. If anyone thinks that, you know, you could be accused of being delusional, because it's these are major interests in this, huge moneyed interests. And as I said, they pay. I used to do it because I believed in the issue to go and get signatures. Forget that. That's gone now. That's gone.
Yeah, I think, David, the genie is out of the bottle, and unfortunately the negative consequences are now felt both in the legislature as well as in the initiative process. I mean, first of all, modifying the Constitution for little tiny things, how we spend money, all kinds of things, that then you've got to, if you ever want to fix it again, you've got to have another proposition to undo what you did. Proposition 13 was a turning point. And if you look at the roots of 13, it was intransience in the legislature to fix a problem that was widely perceived in the country to be out of control, what was happening with real estate taxes in the boom period. They didn't fix it. Now the problem is upon them. The genie's not going back in the bottle, but it gives the legislature a pass. Instead of working out difficult problems, they let the initiative process do it for them. Why should they tangle and have to make compromise and get something to do? I mean, there's one good thing that was passed, forcing the state to get a balanced budget amendment on time or you don't get paid. That was one of the good propositions that happened, but most of them don't belong there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Prop 13 is a real inflection point in the history of this. Between 1910 and 1978, Prop 13, there were, I forget the exact numbers, but several dozen initiatives, but since then there have been several hundred.
And you see what this year's ballot is like.
And
we've got conflicting propositions which kind of do almost the same thing.
Yeah, 30
not
and
quite.
38.
30
Yeah,
38.
And a couple of years ago, we constitutionalized the rights of chickens on poultry farms to have a certain amount of specified space per chicken. That's a constitutional amendment.
Can I add something here? I think it's buyer beware in this area. Now we see what has happened with California's Constitution. And I think when politicians go out and say, let's have a constitutional amendment to balance the federal budget. There you go. There's an idea. How about Congress doing that? So I'm not for parking junk cars in the Constitution. You really have to think these things through. And there's something else, too, that's happened, and that is that on top of what you described, David, historically with the California legislature, is that the people of California put in place term limits. So there is less of an inclination for legislators to take a courageous position with a long-term view, because they're not going to be there. So there are a collision of many things, and I don't think it's good for our state.
So let me ask you guys a question that follows up on the California, but brings us back to the national election. If you look at Obama and Romney, and you look at the big challenges facing our country, education has got to be at the top of the list. What do you think either or both of them ought to be doing, and how do you think the election will affect that in terms of education? Absolutely a pressing issue for half the questions we got from the audience tonight. Sean?
Well, I think there's a separate agenda around K-12 and higher education. I think around higher education, the real risk to the country is, and the crisis, is around a combination of student debt and non-completion. Because, of course, the real problem in the country, everybody talks about the rising cost of higher ed, but the real problem in the country is 45% of the full-time students who start in a four-year institution do not graduate. What is the worst bargain you've made in the world? Borrow money to go to college and don't graduate. That's the worst possible investment. And that's where this growing default, the problem is coming, much of it driven by the default in the for-profit sector. Right? The for-profit sector has a 25% overall graduation rate and is now defaulting at a rate which is 5 times higher than the nonprofit sector. So that's a problem we have to tackle. Yep. There's a way to tackle it. You go right at it and you say institutions are responsible for a percentage of the defaults of students who came to their place. You change it that way, you share risk, all of a sudden you will align the financial incentives of the universities and the student. Okay. So that's the way you tackle that. K-12 is a difficult, a very amorphous, a very challenging thing. I saw some fascinating data which tells you in a minute what our K-12 problem in this country is. Everybody's seen these numbers that show that at the high school level we test 15th in the world in math and science overall among the developed countries. But if you take the data and you split out people who are in the upper half of the socioeconomic distribution in the country from the lower half, the upper half of our country scores 3rd, 4th, 5th. The lower half of our country scores 25th, 26th, 27th. We really have to address quality schools for low-income students. And in my view, this country owes every young person, every child, a decent education. And I don't care how much money their parents have or don't have. We owe them a decent education. And that's where we have to go. No Child Left Behind had some good things in it, but in some sense the cure has some bad side effects associated with it. I wouldn't say it's worse than the disease, but it has a lot of side effects. You go into a classroom now, you see kids spending the first 20 minutes of every day drilling for a test. What do you learn by drilling for a test? You learn how to take a test. You don't really learn the fundamentals that you'd learn. We need to fix that. We need to re-professionalize the teacher corps. We need to say teachers should be evaluated on the basis of what they accomplish with students, but we should pay them more money. We should pay them more money at the same time and say this is a profession. This is a profession. It's something you do, you're committed to. We're going to pay you like a professional, but we're also going to hold you accountable. That's going to mean a much more sophisticated way of evaluating teachers, putting the money. We need to spend, the truth is, you need to spend more money on poor kids because poor kids come in 3 grades level below where they should. They can't even look at a book and tell you which way the sentences run when they start in many neighborhoods. That's something we have to address. We spend more money. They should have a longer school year. We should be investing more in them to try to catch them up at the beginning. So I think a real overhaul is going to be necessary. It's obviously very difficult to do because the feds have only a limited role with respect to this. They can inject incentives, but they can't really solve the fundamental problem. Communities are going to have to solve the problem, which means parents are going to have to get involved, and it's going to have to be much more of a grassroots effort. Long answer, but.
Great answer.
Yeah, no,
and both of you guys, what do you think? Teresa, Anna, what do you think? And also, will this election change what John just talked about?
Well, there is a real difference between Governor Romney and President Obama when it comes to higher education and higher education policies. I want to associate myself with everything that John just said, both in terms of K through 12 and then his observations about the accountability of colleges and universities and the length of time it takes and the dropout rates and the costs that are associated with all of that. Here's what we did when we were in the majority, the last time we were in the majority. And it was a huge battle because, again, huge moneyed interests. What we did was we reformed how the federal government funds student loans. Now, for years and years, I don't know how long, but it's been for ages, there were the middlemen, the banks, and they were guaranteed that they would get their money with a certain percentage for the loan, which was a higher rate, and if anyone defaulted on that loan, they got their money. So we changed that. We took the middlemen out, no more banks, and we lowered the rate for student loans. We multiplied by, I don't remember the exact amount, but it was considerable, the number of Pell Grants, and even returned money to the federal treasury to bring down the debt. Now, the difference between Romney and Obama, that's what I just described is what was done under the Obama administration with, of course, you know, the Democratic House and Senate. Governor Romney would return, put the banks back in, and I don't really know what would happen to Pell Grants. I mean, he has not stepped up on that, and I don't want to sound so one-sided about them, but this is definitely an area where he has not, with the big battle on the interest rates going up, and the Congress had to act, talk about advocacy. This was students across the country that did this. Campus after campus after campus. And of course, we were already for it, but I mean, they, you know, that's a lot of money
this
for
is a
a
very,
middle-class
this
family.
is a very subtle, but it's a very good point. There are times when the for-profit sector does not really add value.
No?
In many cases, the for-profit sector can do a job better than the government.
In some cases.
In some cases.
Yeah,
That's next
fair.
week's class.
It's much better at creating jobs, for example, than right. But there are other. But this is a case where inserting the for-profit sector added no value.
Right.
Yeah.
There was no added value.
And they are still battling this.
Of course.
They are still battling this.
So
They are
it's
still battling
a
this.
good example of a case where I think a more rational approach did really prevail, and it was the right approach.
Teresa, how about Silicon Valley perspective on that?
Well, on this last issue with student loans, I think that everything that John and Anna said is spot on, and I think that's critical. I think on the Silicon Valley perspective, again, perhaps maybe more taking it into the K-12 perspective, I think that you know, President Hennessy, of course, is absolutely right about sort of the lower performing, lower income students. There's actually a company that was started right here in Palo Alto by a former sort of 99 internet entrepreneur, a guy by the name of John Danner, who created one of the first ad server companies. And he's now created a not-for-profit based on software called Rocket Ship Schools. And it is focused, it first started in a school in South San Jose, which is, you know, low income by all the standards that they use in terms of free public lunch, all those other things. But also, I think it was about 2/3 of the elementary school students, you know, English is not their first language. And the software doesn't replace the teachers, but the software allows a teacher who has, you know, maybe 30 or 40 students in a class with no aid, unlike in Palo Alto here, where, you know, through fundraising, we have aides for all of our schools, to have students learn in a more self-paced manner when they're not having formal teacher instruction. So long story short, the STAR test, which is what, you know, my daughter and your kids, anybody who has elementary school students will take in California, that school now has the same STAR test scores as the top 3 performing elementary schools in Palo Alto. And so I think, again, that is an example, just one that I happen to have personal knowledge of, where Silicon Valley, both through the combination of, you know, first do well, then do good, which is very much what John did, but using your same skills and using software development to bring that into the classroom to help. Again, not as a replacement of, but as a supplement to, for students who don't have the ability to get tutors or extra instructional aid. They now get it in the same classroom during the normal classroom hours.
Beautiful example.
All right, we've come to 8:30. Would you please join me in thanking our guest speaker?
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.